So we've talked a bit now, I think, about the sort of idea of cold plunge in your or contrast therapy in your personal experience. I've heard you talk about this in the context of resilience,
Yeah.
and I think that's a really interesting topic. So maybe you can share the way you think about that, and in particular, I'm interested in the way you think about that in the context of longevity, because I think
Yep.
there are clear overlaps and parallels here.
I started studying resilience after Katrina because here I am, an environmental guy. And I went to a workshop that a friend of mine, Rob Annex, had at the National Science Foundation. And it attuned me to this idea that resilience was critical for sustainability. That is, how does our infrastructure respond to a rapidly changing environment? How does it respond to natural disasters? And Katrina happens, and we can see it's a total civil engineering infrastructure failure. You could say there were policy failures, but there's no disagreement that the infrastructure failed the city of New Orleans. And we kind of shoulda, woulda, coulda known. And so I started studying infrastructure disasters. One of the near misses, just as an example, was at the Oroville Dam in California. They went from drought to flood conditions because atmospheric river sets up. There's a lot of precipitation. It comes over the top of snowmelt. The Oroville Dam was on the verge of collapse. So I had to read all of these reports because as a civil engineer looking at disaster response and infrastructure adaptation, I'd say, what went right at the Oroville Dam? What are the organizational adaptive capacity that would prevent. They evacuated everybody downstream, largest evacuation in the state of California history. And they said the dam is going to collapse in 45 minutes, but it didn't. And it didn't because there were two guys who were operating a temporary generator on top of the dam that operated the main spillway. So you got to fire up the generator that already lost power. The generator generates the electricity that runs the machinery that opens up the spillway. When the evacuation was ordered, I talked to the fire chief who was in charge. He said, is the command post in a safe position? No. They had to relocate the command post. And this disrupted their communication. So these two guys who operate the generator that runs the main spillway gate, they lost touch with the command post. And they saw what's going on. And they said, I think we ought to open the spillway. Well, we don't have any orders to do that. I said, I think we're operating without orders. They did that thing, opened it up, got back in touch with the fire chief and said, Chief, there's something we did. We need to let you know. What's that? We've opened up the spillway. How far open is it? As far as it'll go. It's never been opened that fast before. But you're right, Chief. That's why we thought we should let you know. What do you think you're spilling? 110 cubic feet per second, just as an estimate. We've never spilled that much water before. You know the spillway's broken. That's right. Chief goes, do you think that's why the water level is dropping in the reservoir? Yes. Good job. Because they saved the dam by violating the operating rules of the organization. I said, well, this is fascinating. So I get into all this, and I realized infrastructure resilience has nothing to do with the concrete and the steel and the rebar and everything that the civil engineers think it is. It has everything to do with the adaptive response, the creativity of the people in the organization. So I got really interested in the psychology of resilience rather than sort of the physical infrastructure of it. Well, Kelly McGonigal, she's a psychologist at Stanford University. She wrote a book that she popularized with a TED Talk, millions of views, called The Upside of Stress. Have you heard about this one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Turns out people's attitude towards stress dictates the outcome of the stress. If you believe that the stress is something that will leave you in better shape and you can overcome it, you can manage it, and it's going to make you stronger, that's what happens. If you go, oh, stress is killing me, it is. And this is all about your response to the stress, not about the actual stress event itself. Well, she also wrote in there, because psychologists use the cold pressor test. And so she was saying, well, you stick your hand in ice water and it creates pain, and we can measure your response to stress. She's describing this. In order to understand how painful and difficult this is, she says, if I'd put your whole body in ice water for more than 2 minutes, you would die. So there's a lot of this sort of sensationalism about cold blood. And she's wrong, because I've tested this for myself. But she's right about the belief you have is more important than the experience. It is how you adapt to the stress. Let's go a little further. Nicholas Taleb.
Yeah.
He wrote a really good book called Anti-Fragile, which builds on this concept of hormesis. We know that exercise damages the body in the short term. That's why it hurts. But in the long term, it has all these benefits. Exercise makes you smarter. I mean, who would have thought? In a pharmaceutical repair shop model, we sort of get tricked into thinking that there's one diagnosis and one pill that can make one change inside your body. But the body is a complex system, not a machine. And it is impossible to change just one thing. Everything is related. So a systemic therapy like exercise, metabolically, it doesn't just make you stronger. It makes you metabolically healthier. It makes you smarter. It makes everything in the body work better. Cold plunge therapy is like that. It's like sunshine. It is systemic. You can overdo it. You can get a sunburn. You can exercise yourself to death if you're forced to. And you can cold plunge yourself into hypothermia you can take hormesis too far. It's not that which does not kill us. It's not about the injury. We're trying to create a hormetic stress in the body to stimulate this response that brings us back stronger. So this, to me, is all wrapped up in the concept of resilience. What is our adaptive response to change? And it applies just as much to a startup company like Morozco as it applies to our bodies and our health. I'm winding down my old resilient infrastructure research. I still do a little bit of work for the Army Corps. I still have a grant with the Office of Naval Research. And there the question is, when the surprise happens, how do people respond? When the military commander responds with shock, oh, I can't believe this is happening. This can't be happening to me. That must be wrong. It's a maladaptive response to surprise. It turns out that surprise is a fundamental human emotion, like happiness or fear. It's an emotion that prepares our brain for learning. When you respond to the surprise by opening up your sensing apparatus, being more open to information, and updating your belief systems, that's a resilient response. Okay, so how are we going to port this over into health? Our comfort is killing us. My grandfather, he didn't have heated leather seats in his SUV. What we used to call hardship, we now call therapy. And it's because we don't have the hardships that other generations that came before us were sort of forced into. Our bodies suffer as a consequence of too much comfort. We must seek out stress, not the acute injury, but the hormetic stress that stimulates our body. Our body knows what to do. It will do it if we give it the right nutrients, the right environment, and the right stressors to induce those responses. So for me, it seems like my career can be divided into stages that I think of as just sort of one logical arc. But the fact is that there have been episodes at different stages of my career that have called me to question everything that I thought was important, everything that I thought I should be working on, change my focus. Now I'm 58 years old, and I don't think about science or engineering the way I used to. I'm going to build machines that allow people to take charge of their own health. You are metabolically insulin resistant. All right, here's the machine that you need to fix that. One of the things I've been very gratified by is the increased interest in metabolism, mental health. You can take a look at Chris Palmer, wrote that book, Brain Energy. Callie Means has a new book out called Good Energy. She's making the whole podcast circuit to reinforce this idea that metabolic health is health, whether it's mental or physiological. You can't do anything without metabolism. Okay, I can help with that as an engineer.
So I think this idea of hormesis, also has a pretty solid foundation in the biomedical research literature. In the longevity field, there are multiple studies showing that transient, sometimes repeated low-level stress can have long-term protective effects and benefits on lifespan, health span metrics, and even very simple animal models, nematode worms, fruit flies. I think it's interesting how you tied in the psychological response in humans. Obviously, we're not able to assess that if it even exists the same way in these invertebrate animals. But I think one thing we do know, so you already talked about the idea that you can push it too far, right? So that is something to be aware of. And I'm a little bit wary of the idea of stress just for the sake of stress, although I certainly see where you're coming from. And I'm not, it's a hypothesis, I guess is what I would say, because we know you can push it too far and we don't always know exactly where that boundary is. But also one of the things we know is the type of stress matters. And so how do you think about that in the context of hormesis? So, you've talked about sunlight or cold stress, or we haven't really talked about heat stress, but that's sort of the flip side of cold stress. How do you think about the idea that some stressors may be good and some stressors may be bad? What are the right stressors to induce this sort of positive hormetic response? And how do you know when it's become not positive anymore?
When I was in grad school, we had a course in toxicology, which is really important to an environmental engineer. And the professor told me that there is no safe level of radiation exposure. And I wrote that stuff down. You draw the dose response curve, sure. And supposedly with, and I forget what spectrum he's talking about because, my hand goes up and I'm like, sunlight and vitamin D. He goes, no, we're talking about this level of ionizing radiation. And I forget what frequency he qualified these remarks by. His dose response curve was wrong. It turns out that we're not talking about chronic, we're talking about acute. So this is brief, low-level episodes will stimulate a hormetic response, even with ionizing radiation in the body that leaves you more tolerant of future exposures. So there's something called exposure therapy. And the science is really good on this one. Taleb's anti-fragile goes beyond just the hormetic effect. He says people need variability, not just an exposure to a poison makes you more tolerant to that poison or something, but you need exercise and recovery. You need light and you need darkness. You need warmth or heat and you need cold. The human complex system lives for that variability. Taleb would say, you can put your running shoes on, you can run around the track. It's probably good for you. It'd be much better to run the trail, to run the rough terrain, to stimulate your nervous system with the response that your feet have to make, especially if you could do it barefoot or you could do it on some minimal foot protection, to give your body the more variability. And so he stacks anti-fragility on top of hormesis. And I think he's really onto something. Taleb is very critical of the Mediterranean diet. And there's someone, Nina Teichholz. You can look her up. She was a journalist. She just finished her PhD. She wrote a book called Big Fat Surprise, in which she traces the history of the term Mediterranean diet and how it was fabricated out of thin air as a marketing ploy and then enlisted science to give it the allure of some sort of scientific backing. Nina just finished her PhD. And so she wrote the book as a journalist, but she has upped her game in her scientific training. The Mediterranean diet, which has some advantages, the olive oil and the fish, is typically not associated with fasting. What Taleb pointed out in Anti-Fragility is that if you're Orthodox Christian, or if you belong to one of these Abrahamic religions that is in the Eastern Mediterranean, there might be as many as 180 days out of the year where you're not allowed to eat one thing or another, or you just have to go on a fast. He said the advantages of the so-called Mediterranean diet might be in what you're not eating, not the foods that you do eat, which is a completely different way of thinking about it in the United States. Nobody in the food companies makes any money out of fasting, and yet you need the variability, the feast and the fasting, to keep your mitochondria in good shape.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where I now struggle with some of this stuff because I know for a fact from the literature that the data on fasting is largely like non-existent in terms of actual health benefits when you separate out the total caloric consumption, right? So
you're looking at caloric restriction.
That's right.
Yeah.
So and I mean, this is true in animal studies, and I think it's pretty clear in human studies, although I think it's harder to disentangle. But certainly in the laboratory animal studies, if you separate out the caloric restriction component and induce intermittent fasting, really all of the longevity benefits go away. So again, I think from a hypothesis generating perspective, it is reasonable to hypothesize that fasting, it in and of itself may have benefits. And I think you can point to potentially insulin sensitivity.
Mhm.
But that very rapidly in the internet influencer world gets turned into everybody should be fasting. And now it's kind of going the other direction. And all the influencers who were all over fasting 5 years ago are saying nobody should be fasting, right? So
It,
this is the
it sounds so
challenge
silly.
with a lot of this stuff that I run into, right? There is this rush to everybody should be doing this. No, wait. No, nobody should be doing this. No, wait. Everybody should be doing this in the absence of any solid data one way or the other.
It's hard being a viewer to remind yourself that those posts are for clicks,
Yeah,
not for your
absolutely.
health. And the extreme positions are what gets the clicks. The data on caloric restriction in the animal models, very convincing. So you're saying, well, there must be something to that. And if intermittent fasting is a way for someone to get the benefits of caloric, if that's what works for you, terrific.
Yeah.
Like far be it from us to, criticize you for adopting that behavior. There's also been some studies that say they call it fasting mimicking. If you go keto or if you reduce your carbs essentially for a while, there are ways to get what looks like the benefits of what would otherwise be caloric restriction in an isocaloric diet by reducing carbohydrates. I think all these things are interesting. What it means to me is that there's something going on with your mitochondria. It's manifested or it's observable in insulin resistance, that the metabolic and the mitochondrial health are essential for longevity. And there are probably multiple paths to give your mitochondria either the rest that they need or the recovery that they need or the conditions that they need to stay in great shape. I am not a fan of the caloric hypothesis. I think it's way oversimplified.
What do you mean by that?
When I was a kid, this is going to be the long route to the story, Matt, but do you remember the Schoolhouse Rock videos?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
Weren't they freaking great? The conjunction, junction, they're catchy and they're teaching you about grammar. And on health, they were complete crap. There was one on the nervous system, and I went to watch it on YouTube. There's a telegraph line that, I've got yours and you've got mine. It's called the nervous system. They draw upon the analogy of the machine to try and explain to children how the body works. And they even have this song, I'm a machine, you're a machine. And they're trying to teach you about nutrition. And they say, you're like a car that needs gasoline. What terrible nutrition advice came out of Schoolhouse Rock? And yet, at the apex of the Industrial Revolution, at the peak of our technological optimism, it seemed appropriate. And it's totally wrong.
Well, I wouldn't. I guess I wouldn't maybe frame it quite that way. I think it depends a little bit on what the context is and what the goal is, right? So from the perspective of life expectancies, where there was a lot of early mortality, people were lucky to make it to their 60th birthday. We didn't really have to worry so much about the excess sort of caloric situation that we find ourselves in today, right? And we didn't have the proliferation of highly processed foods that are,
Agreed again.
I think many people would argue, addictive.
Yep.
So I think context change, understanding of biology changes. But if our goal is to optimize health span and healthy longevity today, certainly those ideas are outdated and counterproductive.
As a
in many
society,
ways.
we eat way too many calories.
I think
I'm not
everybody
arguing
would agree
about
with that, yeah.
Right? But the caloric hypothesis is being tortured to try and do way more than it's capable of
I guess
doing.
can you clarify for me though what you mean by the caloric hypothesis?
Yeah, the idea that calories in, calories out dictate your weight.
Okay.
I disagree. I say that's an oversimplification.
Okay.
The calories in food are measured by something called bomb calorimetry. So you incinerate the food and you see how much energy, how much chemical energy was embodied in it. But your body and mind, we're not incinerators. And so when people oversimplify this hypothesis that we're, vessels of the first law of thermodynamics, calories in and calories out, they neglect to mention that it's really difficult to measure how many calories you actually absorb from the food you eat. They neglect to mention that calories out is almost impossible to get an accurate measure of. The bomb calorimeter works great as an incinerator, but you don't know how many calories you're we even use this word burning, but I'll say consuming. And so it's very difficult to do an energy balance, like a first law energy balance on the body, because the body is a complex, open thermodynamic system. And so I say it's a oversimplification because what people really worry about is not weight, it's body composition.
Mm-hmm.
And body composition is governed by the chemistry of the body, not by caloric intake. If you could take those calories that you're eating maybe too much of, and put them into hair growth, muscle growth, wound repair, into things that people want, then what are you complaining about the calories for? And here, psychology is really important. You might have heard of the milkshake study because it's sort of made the rounds. It's been sensationalized a bit. And one of the co-authors was at ASU, although I've never met them. In the milkshake study, people are given the identical drink. And in one, they're saying it's a dessert drink, it's a luxury. And in the other, they're saying, it's a super diet drink. The way the labeling is presented doesn't just stimulate appetite in the subject, it stimulates the production of ghrelin. It stimulates the production of those, I hesitate to call them hormones, but those things inside the body that govern the partitioning of the energy into either muscle or fat or whatever.
And I think that's super fascinating, the idea that our psychological expectations can influence our physiological function and metabolic function.
It's amazing.
And it's absolutely true.
Yep.
It reminds me of a study we did in my research lab. This was, God, I don't know, 2009 maybe. We were interested in the role, going back to caloric restriction, of does smelling the food impact the response to caloric restriction? And it turns out it does.
Yeah.
At least in nematode worms, about half of the lifespan extension that comes from caloric restriction can be blocked if they smell the food but don't eat it, right?
Whoa.
So even in these very simple invertebrate models, this sensory perception, the expectation that you're going to eat, has a physiological response. And humans, obviously, we're much more complicated animals. I think the psychological component is much more important. I would also agree with your body composition, but I do want to just touch on this calorie hypothesis, because if I understand correctly, what you're saying is it's not so much that it's not calories in, calories out. It's that we just don't have the tools to be able to accurately measure either of those things.
Yeah.
So the way that people think about
Correct.
it is misaligned with what's actually happening.
You got it.
Okay.
They think they understand it and they don't. They claim to understand it, and because they harbor misconceptions about how we could apply it, they'll go on Twitter and defend it to the death without acknowledging that, it's a crude oversimplification and we should really be more sophisticated about our understanding of what we eat.
So let's bring this back to cold plunge now, because I'm interested in I know you've talked a little bit about the impact of cold therapy on mitochondrial function and metabolism, and I want to talk a bit about that, but also what do we know about the impact on body composition? And have there been studies where people have, say, by DEXA looked, before, probably it'd have to be a 3 or 6 month cold plunge therapy sort of regimen.
Yeah.
What are the changes? Do we know what the changes look like? Or in the absence of that, what would you speculate the changes?
There's some really good studies on this. And I'm going to be an N=1 experiment after you run me through the DEXA
right.
scanner.
We'll get the DEXA data tomorrow.
I'm really afraid to look at it because I weigh about 220 pounds. I'm only 6 feet tall. And by any measure, I'm overweight. And yet here I am doing cold plunge all the time. One of the things that you and everyone else should know is that cold plunge isn't going to help you lose weight. There are a lot of studies about how you activate fat burning, and you do. You can even get a continuous ketone monitor, and you can see the changes in your metabolism when you get into the ice bath. And it does. It lasts for hours. But that doesn't mean you're going to lose weight.
Do you go into ketogenesis?
Yeah, you do. Immediately. And when I say immediately, understand that that's an exaggeration.
Sure.
But the fastest way to stimulate endogenous ketone production is to put yourself in an ice bath.
And what's the physiological mechanism there?
You start fat burning. When you get into the ice bath, brown fat is activated by the nervous system. And so it's highly innervated. You're like, what are all those nerves doing into brown fat? Well, it's activated to sort of switch on when the thermal receptors in your skin are sending that signal up to your hypothalamus. The liver will release glucose. It will spike your blood glucose by releasing a polymer called glycogen that breaks down into simpler glucose, and that is to stimulate, to rev up your metabolism, to get the thermogenesis going. You've activated the fight or flight system, and your brain is thinking you're either going to run, fight, or shiver. So you need that glucose. But you know that we don't store a lot of glucose in the body. There's what's in the bloodstream, and that might be like a couple of sugar cubes worth. There's what's in the liver, and it is exhausted really fast. We have some CGM data on this where you get a spike. A healthy person can go up to about 140 right away, which you'd say if you stayed there, well, you're diabetic. But you don't. You come down within 30 seconds.
And I mean, some people see that in a cold shower if they're wearing a CGM as well.
And it's a totally normal physiological response. So the other thing that happens when you get in the cold is that the white fat cells, not the brown fat, they begin to release lipids into the bloodstream so that they can be carried to the brown fat, and the brown fat can start the metabolism of fat. The body knows that there's only so much glucose. And if you're going to be in here for a couple of minutes, or if you're going to be cold for a while, you got to start burning fat. And so it will initiate fat burning metabolism like immediately. This is why I say it's the fastest way to stimulate endogenous ketone production. Now, if you don't stay in either a fasted or a carbohydrate fasted state, the ketones are consumed. A few hours later, everything's back to normal. But there's something called metabolic flexibility, where the body becomes accustomed to going in and out of ketosis. And I love it, the way that it works for me. I posted an article, Thanksgiving, I love pumpkin pie, and I way overdo it on the pumpkin pie. And then I experienced sort of pumpkin pie regret. And I said, well, that's all right. I'll get in the ice bath. Did 4 minutes in there, peed on a stick. I'm back in ketosis, because metabolic flexibility allows you to switch or simultaneously burn carbohydrates and fat without experiencing what people call the keto flu, or some of the discomfort of what happens when you don't have that flexibility. So where am I going with this? You get into the ice bath and you will burn a lot of calories. You will burn a lot of fat, but your body compensates. There's a good study. These are rats, and they showed that acute cold exposure would burn fat in the rats, but then compensatory metabolic mechanisms at night allowed the body to rebuild all of those fat cells. So if you keep the rats on an isocaloric diet and you say, oh, look, here's the control group and here's the experimental group, and we're going to burn all this fat in the cold, the experimental group doesn't come out any leaner, but you do change the composition of the fat in the body. Dr. Sean O'Mara, whom I've never met, but he's really big on the visceral fat. I don't know if you've seen some of his body cross-sections. Visceral fat, dangerous. Liver fat, dangerous. Your organs aren't supposed to be fat. And when you change, without the overall body composition or without the weight of the body changing, you change it from visceral to subcutaneous,
right,
all the health markers, including longevity or expected mortality, will improve. This is what the ice bath will do for you. You still might be overweight.
So how
I am.
clear is that, though? I mean, again, I want to differentiate between hypothesis from what we actually know. Like, has that been documented in controlled studies?
I've cited, trying to remember where I got the article, but I'll clip the article and I'll put the citations. There's a really good study on liver fat in rats, because you can cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in a rat. We know how to do it. And then you get them in the cold, and the liver fat drops.
And how long does that take?
It's a matter of weeks. Like the adaptation in the body. Now, you can't translate from a rat study to a human study when you're talking like
hypothesis generating, right? Who knows?
But you will notice changes in your body composition if you're doing a regular practice of cold exposure within a matter of weeks. It takes about 10 days.
I mean, this is, again, one of these things where it's frustrating that we don't have the actual human data, because this is easily measured, right? And in fact, I mean, you'll see on the DEXA, you'll get an estimate of subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, and it would be pretty trivial to get 60 people, measure them by DEXA, put them on a cold therapy regimen, 3 months later measure them by DEXA. It would
barely cost us a thing. Now, if I wrote up sort of an exploratory grant and asked the NIH for $500,000, which is nothing for them, but geez, my university has a lot of overhead and these things wind up being expensive, even though you think they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
What would the NIH do with that?
Yeah, I mean, that would never get funded by
Right.
NIH, or at
Right.
least not the NIH study sections that I've experienced. Having said that, there are lots of people out there, lots of foundations with resources that could
Agreed.
fund this sort of research and
That's right.
hopefully
And
get to some
if you
answers.
run one of these foundations, I will donate to you an ice bath to run this study.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, we haven't talked yet about longevity, and my guess is there's little to no data on whether or not this kind of therapy could impact longevity. But, if it is having an impact on visceral adipose and thermogenesis and, glucose metabolism and body composition and inflammation,
all those
there's a
things
clear
are associated.
hypothesis, right, that this would be beneficial to longevity. And there are foundations out there that fund research in this space that I think could support this kind of a study.
I've looked at telomere lengths. I've looked at DNA methylation.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do we have any data on DNA methylation and epigenetic clocks?
Not associated with cold plunge therapy.
Okay.
But I'm not convinced by these measures. What I've seen on the scatter plots, DNA methylation and telomere length are not an improvement on chronological age. They will not improve expected mortality.
So here's the way I would frame it. I think they're both metrics of hallmarks of aging. So again, I don't know how much you're in this world, but there are now people talk about 12 hallmarks of aging, right? So telomere shortening is one, epigenetic changes are another, inflammation is one. And I think so they're measuring an aspect of biological aging, and these clocks have been shown you can detect signatures, particularly with the epigenetics, of strong correlation with chronological age or with what people call biological age, which is, some prediction of mortality risk, instantaneous or 10-year mortality risk. And so you can find strong correlations, but the mechanisms connecting them are completely unclear at this point. So is it a true measure of mortality risk? Is it a true measure of biological age? Unclear. I think the way I would view it is if we had evidence that cold plunge therapy reversed the epigenetic signature, that would be intriguing, right? It would be another piece of evidence that points to potential, maybe more molecular-based benefits in the context of the biology of aging.
So I'm going to go off on what I hope is not a tangent, but this is that hypotheses come from the imagination. Like Einstein valued creativity above all, if you believe some of his quotes. And so I'm going to tell you how I think about it. Life is a thermodynamic process, and this is not speculation. Life is a departure from sort of the entropy-producing heat death of the universe. It's a departure from equilibrium. And so life depends upon a constant flow of energy. In our bodies, almost all of that energy must flow through the mitochondria. And when the mitochondria cease, so to speak, life ceases. Okay, so I'm thinking about life as a thermodynamic process. How should we be measuring the quality of energy flow through the body? The body gives off electromagnetic radiation. That is, the mitochondria and all the processes in the body have, I'm not talking about Sedona aura, that we have an electromagnetic field. We can measure that field. This is not my area of expertise, but Patrick Porter from BrainTap has a device called Neural Check, which has never been explained to me correctly, where and he says, look, we're measuring your meridians and we're passing electricity through your body and we're measuring the energetic field of your body that is produced by the energetic flow through your body. And I'm like, well, that's as intriguing. As an engineer, I want to know the physics of this, and never been explained. But Patrick Porter hooked me up to Neural Check. He said, congratulations, Tom, you're 32 years old. Because he's got this data set that correlates these energy fields to chronological age. And I laugh and I'm like, yeah, I bet you tell all the boys that. He goes, no, I got Dave Asprey's guys through here, and they do really well. They're at 90% optimized and this kind of stuff. I can't help you because you're already at 98. You have nowhere to go. I said, okay, that's, thanks for letting me know, Patrick. 2 years later, he's in Phoenix at a conference. And so I go down there and meet him. He's like, hey, let's do it again. Let's see if you're 34. I was 32. I'm sorry, I was 30 years old. I'd gone backwards 2 years instead of forward 2 years. And it's stuck in my mind. How do we measure the quality of our mitochondria. It's very difficult to do it in a material sense. Like we can measure DNA methylation, we can measure epigenetic markers, and we're looking at the material. If you were to pull mitochondria out of some cell in your body, sample brown fat or something,
Yeah.
there's thousands of copies of the mitochondrial DNA in a single brown fat cell. Which are you going to select? How will you assay them for whatever marker you're looking for? I think it would be very difficult. However, if you could measure the electric field that the healthy mitochondria create when they're working well, perhaps this would be like an indirect way of assessing mitochondrial health. And perhaps Patrick is on to something with his neural check. I wish I knew more about it.
It's intriguing. I mean, again, I think the one assumption I would question, and I don't know the answer to this, is to what extent is the magnetic field mitochondrially derived versus, all of the other components of the cell. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is it's part of it. And I think, this is again, it's a really interesting hypothesis. It's very challenging for me to have much confidence in those kinds of things, in part because I don't understand it and you don't understand it, and I'm not sure the people studying it really understand it. So maybe I think is the answer. I think your point about mitochondrial function is a good one. Although there are tools that people use, in isolated mitochondria in cells in culture to look at the capacity of mitochondria to move electrons and create a electrochemical gradient. So there are measures that we can use that get beyond just single copies of mitochondrial DNA. And I think for now, probably the best measurements are the sort of physiological measurements, that we've touched on already, that look at things like insulin sensitivity and glucose homeostasis and, sort of whole body metabolic response. But, mitochondrial dysfunction is another one of the hallmarks of aging. It's my personal favorite. My lab did a lot of work studying mitochondrial function in the context of aging. So I think it's immensely important. And the way that all of these complex, metabolic responses tie together, I think, obviously there's a lot that we don't understand, but this idea that the metabolic system maintaining homeostasis is really important for health as we age is clearly true. And yet we also know that these systems become degraded with age. And so that's kind of the last sort of topic that I would like to get your thoughts on is, we've talked about resilience, hormesis, and one of the things we know is that with age, with biological age, in every animal, there is a decline in resilience. And so, I think that's one of the fundamentally defining features of the biological aging process, is this inability to maintain homeostasis in the face of external stress. And so how do you think about that in the context of a hormetic stressor, or in the context of cold therapy specifically? And then related, should we be concerned that as people get older, they may become more sensitive to these kinds of stresses? And so maybe the appropriate stress therapy in a young person is going to be different from that of an old person.
What good questions. There are two things that I'm really curious about when it comes to aging. I'm increasingly coming around to the idea that aging is optional. And I know that is an exaggeration. But it's also, a very flattering kind of thing. Here I am at 58. Of course, I want to believe the optimistic. But the first thing doesn't really have anything to do with ice baths, and that is accumulation of iron. And I don't know if you've been looking much at this, but we're better off, especially as men, with low iron, and especially as we get older, than high iron. Mm-hmm. There really are no mechanisms to release, to expunge iron from the human body.
Donate blood.
That's it. Phlebotomy. It's like, it's this weird thing. Like, am I supposed to wear leeches? Like, that sounds medieval. But this is how we get blood this is how we get iron out of the body. And increasing levels of iron, because we can't expunge it, we can't get rid of it, is associated with aging. But it's also associated with some really poor health outcomes. So one is iron. Nothing to do with cold plunge. But the other one is mitochondrial health. Brown fat tends to disappear with age. That used to be that medical doctors didn't think there was anything such thing as brown fat in an adult human being.
Yeah.
And then positron emission tomography, so PET scans, were invented to map tumors. And this team in Sweden, it was about 2009, they said, I think we're seeing brown fat showing up on some of these scans because brown fat will uptake glucose just like a tumor will. In a PET scan, you inject this radioactive tracer of glucose, and then you measure where does the glucose
So
go.
just for people who may not know, maybe you can describe the difference between brown fat and white fat.
They have different purposes within the body. We use this word fat, which is really, it's a misnomer because brown fat is an essential organ in the body. And you could say white fat is too, but they have two different functions. You can create what's called beige fat. You can take white fat and brown it. And so even though I'm saying it's a misnomer, these two cells are closely related to one another. But brown fat is packed with mitochondria for energy conversion, and white fat is principally energy storage. So they have two different functions. Brown fat is associated with neuroprotective factors. That is, it will secrete essential neuroprotective factors like FGF21, which is associated with brain health and recovery from brain injury.
And thought to be the hormone that mediates the lifespan extension in mice from protein restriction.
I had no idea.
Yep. So FGF21 is super interesting.
Yeah.
Not always good, not always associated with good stuff. So it's a stress response hormone.
Absolutely.
But in the context of aging, there's actually a really interesting study. They made a mouse that transgenically overexpresses FGF21. Normal food, transgenic overexpression of FGF21, and it lived like 30 or 40% longer. So
no kidding.
Only overexpressing FGF21 in a mouse. It hasn't been replicated as far as I know yet, but in that one study was sufficient to increase lifespan pretty substantially.
So now we have an understanding that brown fat performs different functions, even if it has some similar sort of biological origins. It's also located in different places. You don't have brown fat around your waist. You have it sort of at the base of the neck, the shoulder blades, a little bit around the heart. You have it where when it is doing non-shivering thermogenesis, it would keep the blood warm before it reaches the brain. So brown fat defends your body. It is part of the resilient adaptive mechanism that your body is built with.
And brown fat tends to express uncoupling proteins.
Right? That's the mechanism by which it will turn glucose or lipids into heat without having to produce ATP. So it's sort of a shortcut on the electron chain. And you can imagine that, here are the mitochondria fooling around with all these electrons and producing heat. Sometimes they escape. Heat is not the only thing that gets produced. There are also reactive oxygen species. Turns out that mitochondria make their own melatonin. And the reason for doing that is to help scavenge these reactive oxygen species and protect the mitochondrial DNA from damage. But if you push your mitochondria too far, you'll consume all the melatonin that they've made, and the RS will damage the mitochondria. That's not the worst thing in the world. The ROS will also signal mitophagy, that is removal of damaged mitochondria, and mitobiogenesis. So we're going to make new ones. We're going to replicate the good copies. But if you never give the mitochondria that sort of recovery time, then you will wind up in a chronically deficient metabolic or disordered metabolic state. Well, how do you keep brown fat into adulthood? It's cold exposure. There are a few things in the diet that will activate brown fat. Berberine is one of them. I take muscle supplement. If I want to skip dinner, I'll have the berberine. I'll rack up my brown fat. It helps me sort of get through.
And again, how clear is that? So I tend to be a bit skeptical about these kinds of things. So how clear is it that berberine actually induces brown fat?
I have not written the article that cited the studies. I've looked at the studies, and these are, again, animal models that say, hey, look, brown fat's on. So
it's interesting, right? Because berberine certainly will impact glucose uptake, insulin sensitivity, to some extent, kind of mimics metformin. We haven't talked about metformin, different beast.
Yeah, and I don't want to have anything to do with metformin. I'm not a fan, and we should talk about it.
So it's interesting, though, because I'm not convinced that berberine is fundamentally different from metformin from a mechanistic perspective.
They do have different mechanisms.
Except we don't really know what the mechanism is for either one. So this is where I start to get very skeptical, right?
Yep. And so I'm saying these haven't been entirely elucidated.
Yeah.
But when you think about the maintenance of blood glucose, there's a balance. There's the rate at which glucose is being taken up and converted into other things, and there's also the rate at which glucose is being produced. And people, they lose sight of the fact that we make the glucose we need. If you are totally zero carb diet, it's okay. Gluconeogenesis will take place in your body and maintain a stable blood glucose. So the glucose balance is more complex. And metformin will reduce blood glucose in an otherwise normal human body. Except that glucose is not the problem with type 2 diabetes. Elevated blood glucose is probably the body's search for a solution. And here's where I'm speculating. Because mitochondrial dysfunction and elevated blood glucose are so closely associated, we don't really know which comes first. And what I'm speculating about is that the body senses the mitochondrial damage, and then the cell wall defends the mitochondria against the action of insulin to prevent mitochondrial overload. That is, I'm suggesting this order of operations that says the mitochondrial damage comes first, and then the insulin resistance, and then the elevated blood glucose. Just getting your blood glucose down by taking insulin or taking metformin, I'm speculating, will put your mitochondria at risk by overcoming this defense mechanism, which is meant to be temporary, to give your mitochondria a chance to recover. And there is a study, one of the authors from Fort Collins, Colorado, study of elderly Americans who were taking metformin and exercising, or not taking metformin and exercising.
That's Ben Miller's work, actually.
Well, Ben Bickman is the one who alerted me to it. And, I got to go read the study. I'm like, well, holy crap. If metformin is counteracting the mitochondrial benefits of exercise, stop taking metformin. I called one of my ice bath customers who's a little older than me, and he's been struggling with his blood glucose. He's now got a CGM. And I said, you're taking metformin? He goes, yeah, my doctor wants to up my dose because I've kind of capped out. I'm in the 140s a lot, and I get up to 190 after a meal, and it's still too high. I said, have you ever thought about quitting the metformin? He's like, no, but should I? He's doing everything right. He's exercising, he's ice bathing, he's watching his diet. And he said, all right, Tom, as an experiment, I'll give it 2 weeks. No metformin. His blood glucose came down. His CGM responded positively. So I'm like, hey, we got to get you on the phone. This is at 6 weeks. We're doing an interview. And he says, and he's eating a sandwich, right, with the bread and everything. He says, I'm eating this sandwich for you, and I want to show you what my CGM, he puts up 94. He says, I haven't seen under 100, like ever since I got the CGM. He's never going back to metformin because, again, he's older, just like the subjects in the study, and he's experiencing the exact same thing that these study participants did. And God bless him because he feels better, he looks better, he's not taking the insulin, and his doctor is sort of whatever works.
Yeah. Which is what, I think that is the right response. It's a super interesting, N of one story. I think on the flip side, the data are pretty clear that diabetics taking metformin way outperform diabetics not taking metformin for longevity. No question about it, for mortality. So in that context, I think it's clear that metformin can have a positive impact on many diabetics. This is where I think the N of one, are there people out there who, if they stop taking their metformin and practice a healthy lifestyle, can reverse their diabetes? Absolutely. Correct. No question about it. I think there are a lot of people that could do that. A lot of people aren't willing to do that. And so, I just want to be careful that the message isn't stop taking metformin, although I think that having an open mind, especially if your primary care doc will go on the journey with you to maybe try alternatives, makes a ton of sense. And again, I think the idea that lifestyle can trump medication when it comes to metabolic disease is really important message. Here's the question I want to
clarify. The message is, if metformin isn't working for you, stop taking the metformin and do all the other things and see what happens there.
I think that's reasonable. Again, I think, and this is where maybe you and I have a little bit differences in our conservatism, although I'm not very conservative when it comes to this kind of stuff.
I'm glad
I would
about
at
that.
least say get your doc involved before you do that. Probably makes the most sense.
And you had another question.
Yeah. So the question, though, in my mind is around berberine. So how do we know that berberine is really any different than metformin? And the exercise, I think it's also worth saying, and I know Ben Miller really well, and I think that his study, and there have been, I think, one other study that showed similar evidence that metformin may blunt some of the responses to exercise, really important. But I think we don't know yet to what extent is that the case, and is that going to be true across different types of exercise for lots of different people? Metformin is a mitochondrial toxin. That's probably its primary mechanism for activating AMP kinase. Berberine also activates AMP kinase and is probably a mitochondrial toxin. So the question in my mind is, why put one in the bucket of good and one in the bucket of bad?
I shouldn't answer the question that I'm not qualified to answer. But I'm really curious. I think you're asking the right question. Are they different? They could intercede in the glucose cycling in different places. And
Sure.
that might be the source of difference. And that's the hypothesis I would want to investigate.
Yeah.
Is it the gluconeogenesis? Is it happening in the liver? Is it happening in the brown fat? Is it happening in the, muscles? So they're different substances. And I remember, if I'm recalling them correctly, looking at them chemically, they're very different chemical structures. And so this led me to the hypothesis that they must work in the body in different places. But I could be all wrong.
Well, both are what I would characterize as very dirty drugs in the sense that they hit, multiple targets. So I don't know the answer either.
Yeah.
I guess I just am hesitant to favor one over the other at this point in the absence of really understanding how they're working.
What if Ben would replicate the study he did with metformin with berberine?
That'd be really interesting.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I brought it up because there are some ways to activate your brown fat with diet. There's an ingredient in hot peppers, for example, that will activate your brown fat. But the best way to do it is cold exposure.
Yeah.
And it could be cold air, it could be cold water.
And how do you measure that? Is there a biomarker?
Yeah. This is Susanne Soberg at the University of Copenhagen, who's probably most famous for doing the PET scans, looking for brown fat and not for cancer. But that's the weird thing is 2009, the Swedish team says, I think some adults have brown fat. And people started looking at the PET scans and finding maybe 5% of the people in those scans showed brown fat. Most adult human beings don't have it at all. Children have it. Infants have it. But some of the people who work outside in like the northern latitudes still have it. So that's fascinating. The PET scan shows up the brown fat because both tumor cells and brown fat will use the glucose that is injected into the body and then traced with the PET scan. Well, now it's not even, 15 years later, you can get a whole PhD in brown fat in something that 15 years ago doctors didn't even think existed in an adult human being. Susanne Soberg did this. So she's got her PET scanners and she brings in these winter swimmers, which is kind of a tradition. You can join a club in Denmark, hop in the fjord. She brings these winter swimmers in and she's looking for brown fat and how to activate it. Sure enough, she finds it. So she asks them questions, how often do you swim and how cold is the water? She finds out that on average, the people that she studied, 11 minutes a week. It's not a magic number. It's an average of a bunch of people who happen to walk into her scanner. But the images that she's published are really good. And some people, because her work has been popularized, some people have made Susanne Soberg's work a target. I'd say, well, that's bad science. I read her paper in Cell. It looks like good science to me. Human beings have brown fat. It is activated in the cold. We can measure it. One cancer patient who read my articles on citing the Secchi study, also out of Sweden, that showed that cold exposure will inhibit tumor growth in mice and that they replicated the uptake of brown fat into uptake of glucose into brown fat in a way that was preferential compared to the tumor cells. That is, the tumor cells were starved of the glucose substrate they need to metabolize in a human being in similar conditions to the mice. So this was an extraordinary, detailed study. Well done. She'd read my article and she said, I am undergoing chemotherapy. We're using PET scans to locate, measure my tumors. I started doing your ice bath thing because my doctor said, well, it wouldn't hurt, you know. This is the brown fat that showed up. This is my before and this is my after. This is a remarkable case study of the before after images. We know this works in people who are sort of otherwise normal. In other respects, we can expect this. And it is a wonderful thing because brown fat is associated with metabolic health.
Yeah.
It's associated with brain health. One thing that Gary Brecka gets right is that thinking of Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes as a metabolic disorder.
At least some types of Alzheimer's, yeah.
Absolutely. But this is the right way to approach brain health, is thinking about how do I take care of my metabolism so that my brain, which is the most demanding metabolic organ in my body, has the energy that it needs.
Right. So PET is not a particularly useful biomarker, though, for a sort of broader study of this.
It's kind of a crappy scan. Couldn't we use infrared?
It's just not widely available.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering if there are any other biomarkers that could be used to assess this. I guess the other thought I have is, to what extent is, and this is now, we're both going to get, I think, probably rapidly out of our areas of expertise. But, a lot of times cells are defined in a very sort of superficial way. We just say, this is immunology is classic for this, right? We've got all these different, immunological cell types that are defined based on a small number of cell surface markers, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent is brown fat sort of defined that way? And is it really a terminal differentiated cell type, or is it? And clearly, if you can switch, if you can beige fat, right, which can happen, it's not necessarily. And so, is it simply the case that in a subset of cells, a new gene expression profile is being established based on the environment? In this case, cold being the environmental factor that's driving this, where you presumably enhance glucose uptake, so you probably got cell surface receptors that are taking the glucose up, and you enhance mitochondrial uncoupling, so you express UCP1, right? And is that sufficient then? Certainly by this PET assay, that would probably be enough to lead to a positive signal. And you could imagine how that could happen quite rapidly, right?
Yeah.
It's just a simple gene expression switch. And so
it's amazing that and if you're looking for this at home, it's called brown adipose tissue. And I'm just using the term fat. But what it means is that it's a cell that contains a lot of fat molecules in it. It's amazing that a cell could change its function from energy storage in the form of fat molecules to energy conversion by building out all this mitochondria.
Yeah.
Bone cells don't do that like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. Although, again, it is amazing, but it's also, from a biochemical perspective, this is an oversimplification. It's actually pretty simple. All you do is you need to express one protein in the mitochondrial membrane that allows protons to leak, right? Yeah. And then the mitochondria start churning and you generate heat.
Yep.
So it's a fairly simple and elegant biochemical solution to an environmental challenge, right? Yep. And one of the consequences is you rapidly take glucose up from circulation, and then that can have downstream consequences on metabolic homeostasis throughout the entire body. And it's not so different, I think, from some of the changes that we see with increasing muscle mass, right?
Yep.
So again, muscle is a great sink for glucose. Yep. And especially if you're exercising your muscle. So, I think there are probably different strategies that can have similar metabolic consequences here.
And bone density changes. Like the body is much more plastic than we've given it credit for.
Is there any evidence on cold therapy and bone biology?
Yeah, there's actually a caution. That is, there's no good numbers on, here's a cohort, and then we're going to start doing the cold, and then it's what happened to their bone density. However, almost all the magnesium in your body, and by almost all, I mean, only 1% is in your bloodstream. So you can't really do a blood assay, measure magnesium, and get a reliable sense. Right. But so most of it is stored in your bones. When you get into the cold, the magnesium is recruited in hundreds of metabolic reactions. And so mitochondria are rich in magnesium. Yep. And so your bones will release magnesium into the bloodstream to ensure that it's plentiful for your brown fat or your muscles or whatever you need. If you never replenish that magnesium, unlike iron, you pee magnesium right out. So if you don't replenish the store in your bones, you will eventually become depleted. And so this is not a contraindication. This is a potential long-term from a series. It can just be acute, few minutes a day. You could wind up magnesium depleted. And so I put Epsom salt in my ice bath. Some people say you can't transdermally absorb Epsom. They're just wrong. Because I don't shower after my ice bath. I shower before, get in my ice bath, and I leave the Epsom salt. Reminds me when I was a kid at the beach, and it gives the magnesium time to get in through the pores of my body. The studies that have used Epsom salt baths to dose magnesium don't measure the blood. They measure the urine. And 2 or 3 hours afterwards, people have more magnesium in their urine. Where do you think that came from? Because those aren't even cold baths. So in this case, the relationship between cold and your bones is important to understand because your bones do need that magnesium.
And I would just add, this is something that you can measure, right? So again,
Absolutely.
You're going to get a DEXA tomorrow. And I think if you don't need to do it all the time, but even once a year, if there is a slow change in bone density, you can measure it and you can see that and you can take action. Do you take a magnesium supplement?
I like magnesium threonate, and I don't always take it. Like I'm traveling, all right, I didn't bring it with me.
Yeah.
But I've played around with taking it in the morning and taking it at night. I take it because I'm curious, not because I'm afraid.
And it's kind of an insurance policy is the way I think. I mean, magnesium, like you've sort of alluded to, is one of these tricky ones where you can't go get a blood test to tell you for sure if you should be taking a magnesium supplement or not. So I'm kind of like you. I take a magnesium supplement sometimes.
Well, it's so easy. It's not expensive.
Yeah.
And if you take too much magnesium, it lets you know.
Right.
Then you just back off.
Right.
When you're on the diarrhea threshold, maybe that's just a little bit too far.
I think that's good advice. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. So this has been a lot of fun. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is important or that you want to discuss?
There are so many things that I wrote a book. I called it Uncommon Cold because it's got like 400 scientific citations. There was no repository of science-based knowledge. And I put a lot of experiences in here, case studies too. And there's like 13 chapters. There's a ton of things. But I think we've hit a lot of the most important highlights, some of the contraindications and the safety concerns, the metabolic benefits. We talked about some of the psychology. And if I was going to leave you with one thought, it is that the people who I talk to who are really into health, who are like really high performers, who you would never suspect. These are elite athletes. These are people like Joe Rogan who will go really deep into health. They all tell me it's the psychological benefits. Mm-hmm. They're not worried about brown fat. They're not worried about, although testosterone is a concern because they don't want to do anything to hurt their testosterone levels. They say, what I get out of it is it's a really hard thing to do. Staring down at the ice and thinking, now I'm going to get in there. When they are able to do that difficult thing that is really unpleasant, it gives them more confidence. It gives them more perseverance. It gives them, Joe Rogan said it was essential for him to prepare for his live comedy special to get in his Morosco every morning. And Huberman did a really interesting podcast with Goggins on this one, talking about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, some portion of the brain that took me a week of practice to learn how to pronounce, that he says grows when you do really difficult things that you pretty much hate doing. It's that, Huberman called it willpower, but he said specifically the will to live. And so it comes back to longevity. When my father passed away, my sisters and I said, isn't that funny that he should pass away on his wife's birthday? We suspect that he laid himself down to bed knowing that he wasn't going to wake up. It's not like he wrote us a note or something, but my older sister in particular had been in touch with him. And I think he was ready to give. He was like, I'm done. I've done everything I want to do. But I'm going to wait until this particular day. And the reason we suspect this is it's too much of a coincidence. His mother passed away on his birthday. Something in his mind was telling himself a story about, I don't know, he was a narcissist, Matt, but how does he make himself the center of attention, in this particular moment that his children are going to remember? I think he chose. So willpower is part of longevity. And this physiological relationship between doing the hard things, the anterior midcingular cortex, where your will resides, I think is part of how you do the hard things as you age that keep you healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the complexity of human psychology, and it's an area that I know I personally neglect because it's hard to measure with the scientific tools that I've been trained in.
Right. And I'm just in my imagination
but I think you're right.
telling these weird stories about my father. And it sounds spiritual or something, but of course it's on my mind. How do I want to go?
But I think, for anybody who's paying attention and open-minded, it's hard to dismiss the impact that our psychology has on all sorts of aspects of our physiology and function. And so it is absolutely not a stretch to think that, even to the point of controlling the time of our own death, that our psychology can influence that.
One thing about that story is he went out on his own terms. Like there's part of me that says, all right, Dad, it changes my grieving process to tell myself a story about how he done the things that were important to him and he was ready to call it quits.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, the lesson here, a couple of lessons maybe are, don't let your fear of the hard things keep you from doing the hard things. And maybe there's value in embracing those difficult challenges.
Remind yourself why you're doing the hard things. Because in the moment, of course, it sucks. And what does somebody say? I don't know, embrace the suck or something like that.
I mean, I think the way I think about it, I often say the journey is the reward, right?
Yeah.
So I tend to try for myself. I don't think of it as this sucks. I think of it as this is the journey, and there's value in the journey itself.
I don't get into the ice bath because I'm afraid I'm going to die of prostate cancer anymore. I get into the ice bath because I tell myself, I want to be the type of person that can do things like this. If I wimp out now, so to speak, if I say, I could skip a day, I don't have to put it on Instagram or whatever, then I become somebody that I want to be. I want to be the type of person who says, yeah, this hurts, or this is going to be difficult, or this is really uncomfortable, but I'm the type of person who does those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, interesting to wonder how much of the value comes from that experience itself. I guess we'll have to figure out how we get the study funded to do that study.
I think we're going to figure it out.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming by today. Like I said, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to see how it goes tomorrow. And then we'll get your biomarkers, and we'll be able to maybe come back and do it again.
Yeah. Well, how could I turn it down? I mean, you got in the ice bath. I got to get through the Optispan.
Yeah, the gateway day. Awesome. All right. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of the Optispan podcast. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit that subscribe button, and I hope to see you next time on the podcast.